Hi, I'm Katie Kahn. In the next 4 videos, I'm going to show you how I use this McCalls 6818 pattern to make this jacket out of some rad sequin mesh I got on eBay. First, I need to choose a size. The pattern says it's a close-fitted jacket, but I can see there's 4 inches of ease at the bust and 3 inches at the waist. I don't consider that fitted, so I'm going to cut a size smaller than I want and see how it looks in the fitting. So I'm starting by tracing the pattern onto dotted paper using a tracing wheel. I do this for a few reasons. So I can use the pattern again in the future or a different size, so that it's easy to alter, and mostly because I just don't like to use 5/8 inch seam allowances. I've redrawn the pattern pieces in pencil, extended the grain line the entire length of each pattern piece, and now I'm removing an 1/8 inch from each seam. I'm doing this for each pattern piece I need, so all of the A jacket pieces and the collar pieces for C. I want to use a separating zipper at the center front instead of hooks and eyes, so I don't need this extra bit for overlap. All I need is a 1/2 inch seam allowance. The sleeve is a little too short for me, and I don't want to go through the trouble of cutting and taping the piece back together at the extension line, so I'll just add a 1/2 inch at the bottom and maintain the original sleeve opening measurement, then blend into the sleeve. I cut out all of my pattern pieces and labeled them with the project name, what pattern piece it is, and how many of each fabric I need to cut. I like to color code the labels so they're really easy to identify. I use black for my self fabric, which is the main fabric, blue, purple, or green for contrast fabrics, orange for lining, and red for interfacings. I also write the seam allowance I used. Now I can cut my fit sample, but I'm doing it a little differently this time. The lining fabric I'm using is so cheap, it's under $2 a yard, about half the price of muslin, so I'm going to use the lining as my fit sample. If it fits terribly and I have to recut it, no big deal, and if it fits well enough, I can reuse it. This isn't something I do all the time. Look at how much larger the yarns of the red lining fabric are than the yarns of the muslin next to it. Muslin is much more structurally sound, and you'll get a more precise sample. So if precision is important, it's best to spend the extra money and use the higher quality fabric. There are a few ways to line up your pattern pieces on the grain. You can measure from the selvage of the fabric to the marked grain line of the pattern piece. If the pattern piece has a straight edge that's on grain, like the center front, you can line the edge up straight with the fabric grain. Or you can fold the pattern piece at the grain line and use that to line up on the fabric. This fabric frays really bad, so I'm going to run all of the pieces through a serger to finish the edges. Here are the bodice pieces all laid out, and I'm going to pin together the front and back princess seams. I'm matching the top and bottom at the stitch line and matching the notches. I'm making sure to mirror the pieces so I will have a left and right side of the garment. Same thing when I pin the sleeves. An easy way to tell on the sleeves is that the front is cut out more because your arms typically hang forward, so there's more cut away there. I'm sewing my seams, removing the pins as I go. I always back tack at the start and end of my seams. Now I can press the seams open. The back bodice doesn't have much curve, so I can press it flat and use a clapper to get a nice crisp fold. The front bodice obviously has the bust curve, so I'm pressing the straight parts here and then using a ham to press the curves. I'm also going to press the sleeve inseam on my, yes, that's right, my brand new sleeve board. I told you I was going to do it. This sleeve board has so much more room than my old one, and it's stable enough that the sleeve just glides right on there. Ugh, so smooth. Now I'm pinning the side seams and the shoulders, and I'll sew and press those too. There's no reason not to use a sleeve board for this. Same thing on the center back. And I'm also pinning the collar pieces. These won't be used on the final jacket, I just want to check the size and the fitting. I trim away the extra seam allowance at the points, but before I flip it right side out, I like to press the seams open as far as I can. This makes it easier to press them flat. The bodice looks good, and now I can set in the sleeves. I hold up the sleeve to see how much ease there is in the cap, and it looks like quite a bit, so I will need an easing stitch. I'm using my normal stitch length, about 2.5 millimeters, and stitching just under 1/2 inch, which is my seam allowance, starting at one of the little dots without back tacking. Stitch around the cap to the other little dot and leave long threads. I pull the bobbin thread to gently gather the fabric and then smooth that fullness across the stitch line so there aren't any folds. This is called easing. See how now the sleeve cap is shaped like it's ready to sit around a shoulder? That's what we're looking for. Now I can pin it into the bodice, matching the seam line and notches. I like to sew from the bodice side because the feed dogs help ease the sleeve cap into the arm's eye of the bodice more smoothly than I could do it. One thing I like to do after it's sewn is remove the easing stitch so that the seam can really relax. And because I'm using this for a fitting first, I don't want to follow the directions and do the second stitch or trim anything away. I'm just going to press the eased seam allowance flat. I drape it over the edge of my sleeve board and press just a little past the seam. Now that's a nice sleeve cap. The lapel and collar pieces get pinned onto the bodice. I'm making sure the stitch line of the lapel hits right at the stitch line and center front line of the bodice. I'm also going to machine baste the seam allowance onto the bodice. So I've set my stitch length to the longest setting, and I'm not back tacking. The collar will be removed after the fitting, so I want it to be easy to take it off. To make the skirt, I'm pinning the center back just to the notches at the back. I'm leaving the slit open, and I'm pressing the seam open. Then I can pin the side seams, matching the notches. It's best to sew from the bottom up because it's less likely to stretch the fabric as you sew this long bias edge. I press that open too, and then I can pin it onto the bodice. I went ahead and made the little front tabs for the heck of it, so I pinned those a 1/2 inch away from the front edge, and I folded the skirt front edge back a 1/2 inch also. I lengthened my stitch a little to sew the waist seam because I'll be taking it back out after the fitting. And I'm pressing that seam toward the bodice, and I'm all set for the fitting. As always, I'll do that in the next video.